Imagine waking up in the morning, no hot shower, no toothpaste, no toilet paper, and if you want clean water, you have to walk over a mile to get it. Now imagine living like that, every single day. That was the reality for millions of peasants. During the Middle Ages, a time when even a small cut could become deadly, and a simple fever could wipe out an entire family. In a world full of dirt, disease, and death, hygiene wasn't just a luxury. It was a matter of survival. But here's something you might not expect. They weren't as filthy as we've been told. Movies, TV shows, even video games paint a picture of medieval peasants as dirty, smelly, uncivilized. People covered in mud, never bathing, rotting teeth, eating with their hands like wild animals. But what if I told you that picture is wrong? What if I told you that medieval peasants actually cared about cleanliness? That they bathed, they brushed their teeth, even if not in the way we do today. That they knew the difference between clean water and dirty water. That they had strict ones about how to handle waste, how to stay clean, and how to avoid disease in a time when doctors were almost useless. Curious yet. Let's travel back in time, more than 700 years, to a small village in medieval Europe where water was more precious than gold, and survival often depended on how dirty you were. This is the untold story of what hygiene was really like for medieval peasants. You're a peasant living in the 13th century, somewhere in the heart of Europe. Maybe in England, France, or the German countryside, your home. A small hut made of mud and timber, with a thatched roof and no windows. Inside, it's dark, cold in the winter, sweltering in the summer. The floor is packed dirt. When it rains, water seeps through the roof and drips onto your bed. You share that tiny hut with your spouse, your children, maybe your elderly parents too. There's one bed for everyone, or maybe just straw on the floor. A fire pit smokes in the corner, and smoke fills the air. There's no chimney dot outside. You tend to your plot of land planting barley, wheat, or cabbage. You raise chickens, pigs, maybe a few sheep. You wake up before the sun rises. You work until the sun goes down. There are no weekends, no vacations. If you get sick, you still work because if you don't, your family doesn't eat. In your village, there's one well. Everyone uses it. It's the lifeline, and near the edge of the village, there are animals and manure piles. The smell is always there. Not because people are filthy, but because animals are everywhere, and waste is part of daily life. Still, even in this rugged world, you've learned something important. If you want to survive, you have to stay clean. Not polished, not perfume clean, but clean enough to stay alive. You don't know what bacteria are. Germs, viruses, those are centuries away from discovery. But you do know something simple and essential. Dirty water makes people sick. Dirty wounds turn deadly. So, you adapt. You don't draw drinking water near where animals relieve themselves. You wash your hands after going to the toilet, maybe just with cold water and some ash. You bathe when you can, even if the river is freezing. You clean your teeth with twigs and mint leaves. You rinse your mouth with vinegar or salt water. You hang your clothes to dry under the sun. You clean them when possible with strong soap made from animal fat and wood ash. It's rough on your hands, but it works. You do all this, not because anyone told you to, but because you've seen what happens when people don't. That child who drank from the muddy stream, gone within days. The neighbor who stepped on a sharp stick and didn't clean the wound, dead in a week. Over the years, your village has developed its own rules, unspoken but powerful. Simple hygiene habits passed down from parent to child. In this world, filth isn't gross. It's dangerous. And so, even in a place with no plumbing, no soap bars, and no toothbrushes, peasants learned to clean themselves the only way they knew how. With instinct, observation, and necessity. This is the beginning of the real story. The one that history books forgot. And now that you know how they lived, it's time to find out. How did they bathe? What did clean mean when water was colder than ice and privacy didn't exist? That's what we'll explore next. Bathing, for a medieval peasant, was not just a matter of comfort or habitat, was a luxury, a choice that balanced delicately between need and survival. And yet, it was also a silent ritual, a moment of cleansing, not just of the body, but of fear. The first challenge wasn't soap or towels. It was water. Water had to be fetched, bucket by bucket, from a well, a stream, or if you were lucky, a nearby river. If it was summer, you might walk barefoot down a dusty path to the stream with your sleeves rolled up, and children tagging along, each carrying a small pot or pail. If it was winter, though, the choice was harder. Ice had to be broken. Fingers froze. And the water that brought cleanliness also brought sickness if you weren't careful. Most peasants bathed outdoors in streams or rivers when the weather allowed. Entire families might go down to the water together, modesty loosely, maintained by clothing or distance. There were no private bathtubs, no scented candles, no heated water unless you boiled it over a fire, and firewood was too precious for that most days. But that doesn't mean bathing was rare. Contrary to modern myths, medieval people, especially peasants, knew the value of washing. Dirt brought infection. Sweat soaked into fabric. Lice, fleas, and skin diseases lurked in the creases of the unwashed. So peasants washed what they could, when they could. On market days or holy days, some villages even had communal bathhouses, simple wooden sheds with large barrels of water or small tubs made of wood and sealed with pitch. Soap was made from boiled animal fat, and wood ash, a harsh, grey paste that stung cuts but cleaned surprisingly well. A weekly or monthly bath was typical. It wasn't every day, but it was regular enough to matter. Children were often scrubbed, more often than adults, especially if they showed signs of illness. Women tended to clean themselves in private, using cloths and warm water when available. Men were more likely to wash quickly in a stream or behind the barn before returning to work, and when there was no river, people adapted. They filled a basin or a bucket. They used rags. They washed their faces, hands, feet, and underarms. First, what we might call the important parts. Full body bathing came second, if at all. Hair was washed too, but not often, not because they didn't care, but because washing hair too frequently with harsh soap could cause more harm than good. Instead, women combed their hair daily, removing lice and debris, and men often kept their hair shorter for practical reasons. Bathing was also spiritual. Before holy days, Easter, or major feasts, many peasants made sure to wash. It was a sign of respect, a way to prepare not just for the community, but for God. And then there were the seasons. In spring and summer, bathing was easier, more frequent. Streams flowed clear, and the air was warm. But in winter, people were cautious. Hypothermia was real, even if they didn't have a name for it. Bathing in cold weather could weaken the body, so in winter, they washed in parts, heated water in pots, used cloths, and and focused on hands, faces, and wounds. What's most surprising is not that peasants bathed, but how seriously they took it. Given their limited resources, bathing was not about vanity. It was about health, dignity, and survival. And when the plague came, when entire towns were wiped out, those who had cleaner habits sometimes survived longer. The link wasn't clear, but the instinct was ancient. To stay clean was to stay alive in a time when medicine was guesswork, and death lurked in every scratch and cough. Water became more than just something you drank. It became a shield, a prayer, a quiet act of resistance. And so, with a bucket of cold water, a bar of rough soap, and the will to endure, the medieval peasant stood beneath an open sky and washed. If you think medieval peasants didn't care about their teeth, you might be surprised. They didn't have toothbrushes. They didn't have toothpaste. They didn't visit dentists because there were no real dentists, at least not for common folk, and yet, they did clean their teeth. Oral hygiene, in the Middle Ages, wasn't cosmetic. It wasn't about having a perfect smile. It was about pain, infection, and survival. Rotten teeth meant more than bad breath. They meant sleepless nights, aching jaws, swelling, fevers, and at worst death. A tooth infection, left untreated, could kill, so peasants developed methods, simple, primitive, but effective in their own way. One of the most common techniques was chewing on twigs, specifically from certain trees like hazel, ash, or willow. These twigs had natural antiseptic properties. Chewed at one end until it frayed, they became a kind of homemade toothbrush. Peasants would rub the fibers gently against their teeth to scrape away debris. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Some used linen cloth, rubbing it over their teeth after meals. Others rinsed their mouths with vinegar, salt water, or even wine if they could spare it. Herbs played a big role too. Mint, sage, rosemary. These weren't just for flavor. People chewed them to freshen breath and ease mouth pain. In some regions, they even boiled herbs into mouchoirs. As for toothpaste, there was none. But people made their own powders, a mixture of crushed charcoal, ground salt, and sometimes ashes or chalk. The taste was bitter, the texture gritty, but the goal was to clean, not comfort. Children were taught to clean their mouths early, not every day, not perfectly, but regularly enough to avoid the worst, and it helped that the medieval diet for peasants wasn't full of sugar. No candy, no soda, no processed sweets. They ate coarse bread, vegetables, grains, and maybe honey on rare occasions. Fewer sugars meant fewer cavities. Still, toothaches happened. When they did, remedies ranged from the creative to the terrifying. Some villagers would place cloves or garlic on the aching tooth to dull the pain. Others applied poultices of herbs and mud. And if the pain became unbearable, there was one last resort. Pulling the tooth. No anesthesia. No clean tools. Just strong hands, a heated knife, and prayers. Some blacksmiths or traveling tooth pullers claimed to know the trade. Most were rough, imprecise, and often made things worse. But for the desperate, it was the only option. Despite all this, the idea that peasants had blackened, rotting mouths isn't entirely true. Archaeological studies have shown that many medieval skeletons have surprisingly decent teeth. Worn down, yes, but not always riddled with cavities. In some cases, their teeth were healthier than ours today. Why? Because they ate simpler foods. Because they didn't constantly snack. And because, even without modern tools, they tried to stay clean. Their methods were humble sticks, salt, herbs. But their purpose was serious. Pain was real. Infection was deadly, and hygiene was one small way to fight back. So the next time you pick up your toothbrush, pause for a second. Think about the peasant child chewing mint leaves in the field, or the mother carefully wiping her toddler's gums with a cloth soaked in vinegar. No foam, no electric brush, no minty gel, just instinct, wisdom passed down, and the will to survive. Clothing was precious to a medieval peasant. You didn't own many outfits, usually just 1 or 2 sets for everyday work, and maybe a cleaner tunic for Sundays or holy days. So when those clothes got dirty, and they always did, you cleaned them. Not for fashion, not for comfort, but because filthy clothing made you sick. Washing clothes was hard work. There were no washing machines, no running water, and no laundry detergent. Everything had to be done by hand by river, in a wooden tub, or with buckets of water fetched from the well. Ash was the peasant's best friend, mixed with water. Ash from burned wood created lye, harsh alkaline substance that worked like soap. You'd soak your clothes in hot water and ash for hours, then scrub them on rocks or wooden boards, beating them to loosen the dirt. The smell was sharp and the process rough, but it worked. If you had access to soap, it was homemade from animal fat and ash, boiled down into sticky grey bars. It stung the eyes, dried out the skin, and left a strong odor. But it could strip out stains, sweat, and lice. Washing day wasn't weekly for most families, was monthly, or done when absolutely necessary. And when it happened, it was an all-day event. Women gathered near rivers or wells. They scrubbed, rinsed, and wrung out heavy wool and linen, often in cold weather, with frozen fingers. Children helped. So did older daughters. It was exhausting work, but also social. Stories were told, songs were sung, gossip passed quietly between buckets and steam. Drying was done in the sun, clothes hung on bushes, fences, or laid out on grass. In the winter, garments froze stiff before they ever dried. Still, they were cleaner than before. Most peasant clothing was made from linen or coarse wool. These natural fibers were durable but held odor. Linen was worn next to the skin. It absorbed sweat and was easier to wash. Wool was heavier, harder to clean, and often wasn't washed as often, just aired out and brushed. Underclothes, when they existed, were washed more frequently. They were the first to touch sweat and dirt, and even if they were just rough linen, wraps or shirts, peasants tried to keep them clean. Lice and fleas were a constant battle. People boiled clothes to kill them, or dusted them with crushed herbs or ashes. They hung garments near smoke to drive insects away, and if something couldn't be cleaned, it was patched, reused, or turned into rags. Clothing hygiene wasn't just about the clothes themselves, it shaped social interactions. Turning up to church in a filthy tunic was shameful. Appearing before the local lord with a soiled cloak could mean punishment. Clean clothes showed effort, respect, and survival, despite everything. Peasants cared. Not because they had time to spare, but because they couldn't afford not to. Illness came quickly through filth. A flea could carry disease. A dirty shirt could infect a cut, so they washed with what they had. Water from the stream, ash from the fire, hands that worked from sunrise to sunset. It wasn't perfect, but it was practical. And in a world where staying clean could mean the difference between life and death, they did what they could. One wash at a time, one shirt at a time. One family trying to stay alive. Everyone poops, even in the Middle Ages. But when there are no toilets, no plumbing, no sewage systems, where does it all go? For the medieval peasant, managing human waste was a daily reality. Not glamorous, not comfortable, but necessary. Most villages didn't have public toilets, and peasants didn't have private bathrooms. Instead, they relied on something simple, the latrine pit, a hole dug in the ground, often at the edge of the property, sometimes surrounded by a few wooden planks. For privacy, families shared one, sometimes neighbors shared one, too. When it filled up, they covered it with soil and dug a new one. The smell was ever present, but people got used to it. They had to dot in some households, especially those closer to town or with slightly more means. There were chamber pots, small bowls, or jugs kept under the bed or in a corner. They were used at night or during storms, then emptied outside in the morning, sometimes into a pit, sometimes onto a compost heap, and sometimes if no one was looking into the street. That's right, in some villages, waste was thrown into the gutters running down the middle of the road. Animals picked through it. Rain washed it away. And yes, people walked right beside it. But even that had rules. Villages had local customs and laws about where you could dump waste. Throwing it too close to a well or a church, forbidden. Tossing it onto your neighbor's land, a fine. Dumping at night without calling out a warning, considered disrespectful and dangerous. In cities, people would actually shout before dumping. Waste from upper windows, gardes low. In French, look out for the water. It was a crude warning. Step aside or be splashed with more than rain. Peasants didn't have toilet paper. Instead, they used moss, leaves, straw, or even pieces of old cloth. Not soft, not sanitary by today's standards. But it worked. Children were taught early not just how to go, but where to go. Because placing waste in the wrong spot could poison water, spread disease, hurt the entire village. Surprisingly, waste wasn't always seen as a problem. Sometimes, it was a resource. Animal dung was used as fuel or fertilizer, and so was human waste, though more cautiously. Some families collected it, let it rot down in pits, then spread it on distant fields. It was dangerous if used fresh, but valuable after time. Still, waste brought risks. Open latrines attracted flies, which spread disease. If pits were dug close to wells, the water became deadly. And during floods, everything mixed together, causing outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, or worse. Villagers learned from experience. Keep the latrine downhill from the well. Don't build it near livestock. Pens, dig deep, but not too deep. Cover it when not in use. They didn't have science. They had survival, and they paid attention. There were also communal responsibilities. Villagers sometimes assigned people to dig new latrines or to clean public areas. Some had fines for households that didn't manage their waste properly. In the end, it wasn't about luxury. It was about life and death. Human waste, left uncontrolled, could destroy an entire village. But handled with caravan, with bare hands, moss, and wooden buckets, it could be managed. Was it clean? No. Was it effective? Enough. Because the peasant didn't have the choice to be disgusted. They had to deal with it, and they did. Every single day. For the medieval peasant, water was everything. It was life. It was labor. And it was always in danger of becoming death. There was no plumbing, no faucets, no filters. Every drop of water had to be gathered, carried, stored, and used with care. Villages typically had one or two main sources of water: a well dug deep into the ground, lined with stones, or a stream flowing nearby, cleanest in the morning, muddy. By afternoon, sometimes a pond, occasionally rain barrels under thatched roofs. Fetching water was a chore, and it wasn't light. A full wooden bucket could weigh 20 to 30 pounds. Women, children, and even the elderly made multiple trips each day before dawn. After work, just before sunset, the water wasn't just for drinking. It was used for cooking, bathing, washing clothes, cleaning wounds, and watering animals. The danger, it was constant. If the water came from a stream, it could easily be contaminated. Dead animals upstream, waste dumped too close, floods mixing sewage and soil. One mistake and the whole village could be vomiting by the next day. So peasants learned they didn't drink from where animals bathed. They avoided water that looked cloudy, smelled wrong, or had a strange taste. Some families even let water sit overnight so the sediment would sink to the bottom. In wealthier towns, some people boiled their water before drinking it. But firewood was scarce, and boiling meant time something few had to spare. Instead, peasants often flavored their water to make it safer and more palatable. They added vinegar, or boiled herbs like thyme and mint, creating weak infusions that masked taste and maybe helped kill microbes. They drank small, kind of watered-down beer, low in alcohol, safer than raw water. Even children drank it. Wells, though safer than streams, had to be maintained. They were covered to keep animals out. Some had stone lips built around them to prevent people from falling in or dropping waste nearby. If a well became contaminated, people noticed fast. Sudden illness, unusual smell, foamy water. It was terrifying and sometimes irreversible. In droughts, the problem flipped. No water at all, streams dried up, wells dropped low, families rationed every drop, bathing stopped, clothes went unwashed. Even watering crops became a gamble. Some villages had designated water guardians, people responsible for watching the well, warning of contamination, or organizing repairs. It was a role of trust, because bad water didn't just hurt a family, it killed communities. And then came winter. Water froze, buckets cracked. People melted snow or broke ice just to get enough to cook. They risked frostbite just to stay clean. Still, peasants persisted. They learned how to spot safe water. They knew which streams ran cleanest, which wells were deepest, which barrels needed new lids. And when they had no choice, they prayed, because water wasn't just a resource, it was a risk. And every sip could be your last or your salvation. In the modern world, we take it for granted. We turn a handle and it flows. Clean, hot, cold, safe. But for the medieval peasant, water was never simple. It was something they feared, respected, protected, because they knew the truth. It could heal you or kill you. When sickness came to a medieval village, it didn't knock on the door. It crept in silently, through a cough, through a wound that didn't heal, through a fever that burned too hot and too long. There were no hospitals, no doctors in white coats, no antibiotics, no vaccines, no antiseptics, only instinct, observation, and trial by pain. Peasants knew what sickness looked like. They saw it every year. The baby who stopped breathing in the night, the mother who died after childbirth, The strong young man who developed a cough and faded away. Disease was everywhere, but so was knowledge hard-earned, passed from mouth to ear across generations. Villagers believed that bad smells caused illness, the miasma theory, so they burned herbs in their homes. Rosemary, lavender, sage. They hung sweet-smelling flowers near their beds. They swept out animal waste and opened windows when possible. They believed that balance in the body was key. Too much heat cooled the body. Too much cold warm it up. They didn't have thermometers, but they had hands, sweat, and experience. If someone had a fever, the local healer might apply damp cloths to their head, or offer an herbal tea made with chamomile, elderflower, or yarrow. If a wound turned black or swollen, it was washed with vinegar or wine. Sometimes honey was applied. Wasn't just sweet, but healing. Honey kills bacteria, though peasants didn't know why. They just knew it worked. Garlic was eaten raw, not for flavor, but for strength. Some called it poor man's medicine. And then there were amulets, charms, prayers. Spiritual health mattered just as much as physical. Sickness could be a punishment, a test, or a curse. So people prayed. They asked saints for help. They visited shrines. They wore crosses, carried bones of saints, tied blessed strings around their wrists. When the plague came, black boils, purple rashes, death in days, panic spread faster than the disease. Villages emptied, whole families disappeared. Those who stayed tried everything, burning clothing, isolating the sick, even lighting fires to purify the air. And some survived, not because of medicine, but because of luck, distance, or better hygiene. People who washed more, handled waste carefully, or lived further from busy roads, sometimes stayed alive and still. Peasants didn't give up. They learned what herbs reduced pain, which wounds could heal, which fevers meant death. They passed down remedies made from roots and bark, leaves and flowers. Women were often the keepers of this knowledge. Mothers, midwives, widows. They treated colds, delivered babies, stitched wounds, and comforted the dying. They didn't wear titles, but in every village, there was someone the others trusted when sickness came. And yes, there were mistakes. Leeches, bloodletting, potions that did more harm than good. But they were trying with the tools they had. And one tool mattered above all. Cleanliness. The peasants who washed hands after tending animals, who boiled cloths, who didn't drink from muddy ditches. They didn't know why it helped. But it did, not perfectly, not always, but enough. Because fighting disease in the Middle Ages wasn't about defeating it. It was about enduring it. And those who endured lived to teach the next generation. When we imagine the Middle Ages, one image often comes to mind. The peasant, dirty, smelly, covered in mud. And the noble, perfumed, dressed in silk, seated in a candlelit bath. But what if that image is wrong? Because the truth is, didn't always come with money. Sometimes it came from necessity. Let's start with the nobles. Yes, they had more access to luxury. Some castles had rudimentary bathrooms. There were large wooden tubs for bathings, sometimes even with heated water. Servants could fetch buckets from the kitchen, adding herbs and oils to the bath. Lavender, rosewater, milk, in rare cases. But here's the problem. Bathing wasn't always trusted. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially among the upper class, doctors began to believe that bathing could open the pores and let disease in. They thought water made the body vulnerable. So many nobles began to avoid bathing entirely. Instead, they masked odor with perfume. They changed their clothes, often linen, undergarments especially, but the body, it stayed untouched by water. For weeks, sometimes months. Some nobles prided themselves on how little they bathed. To them, a dry body was a healthy one. Meanwhile, the peasant was doing something very different. Working in the fields meant sweat. Sweat meant discomfort. So, peasants washed maybe not every day, but regularly enough to stay comfortable and clean. They bathed in rivers. They scrubbed their skin with coarse cloth or sand. They washed their hands and faces, rinsed their mouths, and kept their clothing as clean as resources allowed. Why? Because they had no servants, no scented oils, just the consequences of dirt trashes, infection, disease. So peasants cleaned out of practicality, because they had to. And there's more. Nobles often lived in massive stone castles. Grand but cold, damp and dark. Mold grew on the walls. Chamber pots were dumped out windows. Ventilation was poor. Fleas and lice were common in feathered beds and velvet curtains. Meanwhile, the peasants, home teeny as it was, had airflow, thatched roofs, gaps in the walls. Yes, it let in cold and wind, but also sunlight and fresh air. And let's not forget, nobles owned animals too. Horses, hounds, falcons. They kept them close inside halls, near the hearth. With them came smells, droppings, fleas. So who was really cleaner? It depends. The noble had silk sheets but didn't wash. The peasant had straw bedding but rinsed in cold rivers. The noble wore perfume. The peasant wore soap made of ash and fat. The noble dined with gold forks but never washed hands. The peasant ate with bare hands but wiped them often on linen or moss. Archaeological evidence supports this. Skeletons of nobles often show worse dental hygiene than peasants' more cavities, more abscesses. Their diet was richer, filled with sugar, meat, and wine. Peasants ate coarse bread, grains, and vegetables. Harder on the teeth but better for long-term health. In short, wealth brought comfort, but not always cleanliness, and the poor, with little to spare, often did more with less. They washed not because they had the time, but because they couldn't afford to be sick. A week in bed could mean starvation. A wound gone rotten could mean death. So they cleaned, quietly, diligently, without silver, basins or ivory combs, just water, ash, cloth, and the will to survive. Maybe they didn't smell like roses, but they knew what it meant to be truly clean. We laugh at the past. We picture peasants wading through filth, never bathing, their teeth falling out, lice crawling through their hair. We assume they lived in ignorance, that they didn't care, that they were dirty because they chose to be. But the truth, they cared deeply. They may not have had microscopes or soap commercials, but they had eyes, they had pain, they had consequences, and that was enough. They washed not to look good, but to stay alive. They cleaned their homes to keep disease away. They filtered water with experience, not with carbon. They brushed their teeth with twigs, rinsed with vinegar, scrubbed their skin with ash. They knew what would happen if they didn't, and they learned from mothers, from elders, from stories told beside fires. They didn't understand bacteria, but they understood rot. They didn't know about germs, but they feared wounds that wouldn't heal. They didn't talk about hygiene, but they practiced it in ways that made sense for their time. Yes, there were flaws. They lacked sanitation systems. They believed in bad smells and magical cures. Some practices harmed more than helped. But step back, look at the world they lived. In no electricity, no refrigeration, no running water, no hospitals for the poor, and still they found ways to wash, ways to treat, ways to survive. They built knowledge from trial and error. They passed it down like treasure. And what about us? We who flush and forget. We who press a button for hot water, who buy soap in 12 cents. We often judge the past with modern eyes, not realizing how much we've forgotten. We've forgotten what it means to haul water in freezing rain, to bathe in a river beside your cow, to heal your child with herbs you grew yourself, to hope that clean hands might be enough. Medieval peasants were not fools. They were survivors. Every drop of water they carried, every wound they washed, every cloth they boiled was an act of resistance against sickness, against death, against a world that offered so little safety. So the next time you think of the dirty Middle Ages, pause and remember the hands that scrubbed raw linen in icy streams, the mothers who combed lice from their children's hair, the fathers who washed their feet after working the fields, the families who dug latrines far from the well because they knew, somehow, that it mattered. They weren't dirty. They were doing their best, and maybe that's cleaner than we think.